My guest today is Dr. Reggie Perumal, a specialist forensic pathologist in South Africa who has worked for the state and as a lecturer at the University of Natal, and he's been in private practice since 1994. Welcome, Dr. Reggie.
Thank you, Mickey.
Now, in 1997, I remember during the Phoenix serial killer investigation in KwaZulu Natal, the killer, Sifu Twala, left the bodies of his victims in the sugarcane fields because he knew that the cane would be burnt before harvest. So he thought that the evidence would be destroyed completely. And I think many members of the public are under the impression that to conceal a murder, a body is burnt so that becomes ashes. But that's not the case, is it?
That's correct. That's not the case. Unfortunately, for a body to be burned to ashes, it's mainly at commercial crematoriums that happens. And that's because there's significant amount of heat there, usually more than 650 degrees centigrade. And, it's continuously fed fuel. So over about 1.5 to 2 hours, that's when you get a body burnt to ash. But in an open field, it's different. The amount of fuel that is being used to burn the body is not the same. Plus, you've got other factors like wind factors, etc. So the body does not really burn to ashes. It may burn and reduce in size to that of a young child or an infant, but it won't necessarily burn to ashes. Certainly not to ashes.
I remember as well, even though we found those burnt bodies in the beginning, we could still identify some of them. So, how would you go about identifying them?
Yeah, at the identifying of a body that is burned, for example, amount of human tissue left. And the most important way of identifying is what clothing, if there is any clothing left behind, usually in the groins and the armpits. Other means of identifying type of jewelry or old trauma, fractures of bones that have healed, etc. And then dental identification. We look at teeth. Teeth are quite resistant to heat damage. It's the most resistant bone in the body. So no matter how much the body is subject to heat out in a field or in a vehicle, teeth still remain. There are people who have said that even when bodies are burnt in a crematorium, in a commercial crematorium, when they get their family remains, there are people that say, no, but we actually found teeth in it. That's
Yes.
because teeth are extremely resistant to heat. So the teeth are very useful in identification.
And what actually happens to the body when it burns?
Well, depending on the heat, if you say talk about burning out in the field, it's mainly the flesh that burns, and once that burns, there are certain artifacts that take place. The tissue stretches; it looks as if the person's got an injury, like a laceration. Then there's contraction of tissue, and there appears to be fractures of the bones. That's what we call burn fractures. And then with the head, you get skull fractures, and it appears as if the person was assaulted. You may find even inside the head, you get, because of the heat, you can get an artifact called a extradural or a burn hematoma. So with the heat, there's tissue destruction, first the soft tissue, and then ultimately the bones are affected until you get a charred human remain, just like just black suit and
Yes.
tissue.
I suppose as well, I'm just thinking from a detective's point of view, if you now get the skull fracture cracking, then detectives might think, that was a murder, or there was a head trauma before the body was burned. That could actually have happened.
Yeah.
How would you determine the difference between, you know, a fracture before and a fracture due to the heat?
Well, firstly, if there's a fracture, unless it's an incised fracture or a gunshot wound with clear punched out holes, any other form of fracture will be hidden because the heat from the fire would damage the skull bones to the extent that they can be hidden. But w- I've done cases where there's a gunshot wound through the skull and it's still visible even in a charred human remains.
Mm.
And if there's an incised fracture of the skull, like, for example, a sharp instrument like an axe or in a bush knife kind of equipment, then you can still see incised fractures. Burns won't leave an incised fracture or a perforation.
I think as well, speaking of concealment, one of the big cases in South Africa was Thabo Bester, who had the body of Katlego Bereng burnt out in his cell, and that trying to conceal, his escape. But you must have had some interesting, either in insurance or concealment cases.
Yes. Well, in that case, what happened was they did get a deceased body they purchased, and they put it in a cell and burnt it. I don't know if I mentioned this already. The heat, the amount of heat that's generated from fire in a room or a cell like where he was detained is not sufficient to destroy the body beyond recognition. In that case, there's still sufficient material, either blood or DNA. DNA in the form of uh, extraction from the teeth or from the head of the femur. So there's extraction of DNA. Once there's a profile obtained, then it's compared with the relative. And in this case, Thabo Bester, the deceased there, was identified using his parents. And then there was a case that I did many years ago where somebody wanted to claim their insurance policy. So they bought a pauper body, unclaimed body from the mortuary for as little as 50 rand. And they drove the vehicle along the sea, parked it at the seaside, put the deceased in the driver's seat, and set the vehicle alight. So a deceased person was found on the driver's seat in a burnt vehicle. The problem was there was still a fair amount of human tissue left. There was charred human remains. Blood was available, especially in the back end of the abdomen behind the liver. All we need for DNA is a little drop of blood. So that blood was used. The alleged deceased's parents were contacted, and the mother was proven to be the the parents were not linked to that deceased in, in the burnt vehicle. So it's not uncommon for people to try and claim for insurance purposes where it's presumed that they died as a result of being burnt in a motor vehicle.
Yeah. What I'm also thinking, is the difference between burning or cremation, and I'm thinking of a pyre. You know, if the body is burnt on a pyre, how long will it actually take for that body to be destroyed? Does it have more heat?
Okay, now the commercial crematorium, it can take from anywhere from 1 hour upwards, say from 1 to 2.5 hours. Now that's heat, but the minimum heat is 650 degrees centigrade. It's usually about 800 or 900 degrees centigrade. Now that takes from 1 hour to 2.5 hours. When a pyre, if somebody's placed on a pyre, that's outside, that's out in the environment. There's an issue with the heat because it's not as high as a commercial crematorium. Then you got other factors like wind. So it takes much, much longer for the body to burn. And then there comes a stage when that pyre collapses and the body falls to the bottom. And it takes a long time for it to burn, absolutely long time. And even there, you won't end up with cremated remains like in a commercial crematorium.
Dr. Reggie, I'm just thinking as well, there was the practice, and I think it was banned quite recently, of sati, where a widow would get onto the pyre of her husband willingly. But what I'm thinking, even if you burn your hand on a stove, your natural reflex is to pull it away, or if we approach a fire, just the heat of the fire makes us move away from it. So there must be quite a determination for them. I mean, wouldn't they start scalding even if they just approach the fire?
Yes, I think the mental determination to want to end your life, which is effectively a form of suicide. We all know, and like you rightly pointed out, even as kids, they know if you touch something hot, you'll get burnt. And as you approach fire, the heat would ordinarily repel us from the fire. We would step back. But if the person determined, it must be a strong motivation, determination to end your life. Like you said, as you get close to the fire, you start feeling the heat, you get scalded, and to then, fall upon the remains, the burning remains of your husband, it must be horrific, in terms of pain and mental anguish. So yeah, it's an awful, awful kind of death.
Thank you, loyal listeners, and please follow me on Substack.